Welcome back, listeners, to Sandman Stories Presents, a folklore podcast where I read you to sleep or until the next story. I'm your host, Dustin. Today we are back in the book of folktales from the Azores by Elsie Spicer Eells. In the first story, a maiden must choose between trouble when she is young or trouble when she is old. And in the second story, a robber learns to be careful where he puts his hands because of the wisdom of the youngest of the three daughters. Okay, let's begin. Trouble When One's Young, the story of a maiden's choice. Long ago there lived a beautiful maiden whose name was Clarina. She had been betrothed to a prince whom she had never seen. When at last she should be old enough to receive the rule of the kingdom, he was coming to claim her as his bride. Clarina lived in a magnificent palace surrounded by a beautiful garden. Every day she spent many hours among the lovely flowers and trees. One day an eagle alighted on the tallest tree in the garden. "Good morning, fair Clarina," he said to her. "Good morning," she replied in surprise. Never before had an eagle spoken to her. "Which do you prefer? Trouble when you are young or when you are old?" asked the eagle. Clarina did not know what to say. That night she asked her mother which would be better to choose. "Choose trouble when you're young, dear child," advised her mother. "When you are young it is easy to bear anything, but when you are old you can endure nothing." She remembered her mother's words. Next day, when the eagle again addressed the same question to her, she answered, "Trouble when I'm young." Clarina had hardly said these words when the eagle lifted her up by the pink skirt she was wearing and carried her away. On he flew over seas and mountains. Clarina was frightened nearly to death. At last the eagle set her down in a strange land. She was hungry and accordingly hired out in a bake shop to earn her living. She would have been happier if the eagle had flown away, but he remained in a nearby treetop. The baker went out, leaving Clarina to bake the dough in which he had left ready to put into the oven. The little maid carefully closed the door and all the windows so that the eagle would not be able to get inside. As soon as the baker was out of sight, however, he flew down the chimney. He tore about in the bake shop, spilling all the dough on the floor and breaking the dishes. Then he went back up the chimney when he had completed all the damage there was to be done. When the baker returned, he flew into a terrible rage. He gave poor Clarina a beating and turned her out into the street. She walked about the city and at last found work as a shopkeeper in a little shop on a corner. The owner of the business went away the next day, leaving her in charge of everything. As soon as he was gone, she shut the door and all the windows, but the eagle flew down the chimney and broke the cups and glasses and plates which were set out for sale in neat rows upon the shelf. "What have you been doing in my shop?" cried the owner, in anger when he returned and saw the destruction which the eagle had left behind. He didn't give the poor girl a chance to reply, but seized her roughly and threw her out into the street. Clarina walked and walked seeking work, and at last she arrived at the door of the royal palace. "Do you happen to need a servant?" she asked the queen. "I have all the servants I need," replied the queen. The prince was standing nearby. "Hire her, mother," he advised. "She'll do to take care of the ducks." Accordingly, the queen hired Clarina to care for the ducks. The next morning, all the ducks in the royal duck yard were dead. The eagle had killed them all. "Hire her for a seamstress, mother," said the prince. "The poor little thing is crying as if her heart would break. I'm sorry for her." The queen hired Clarina to be a seamstress in the royal palace. That very day the prince left home to visit his betrothed. He was going to marry a beautiful maiden in a neighboring land whom he had never seen. As he left the palace, he asked each of the servants what gifts he should bring them at his return. When he came to Clarina, her reply was, "Bring me a stone from the palace wall of your betrothed." The prince thought it was a strange request, but he promised to fulfill it. As soon as the prince arrived in the land where his betrothed lived, he found out that the palace was in mourning because of her mysterious disappearance one day from the garden. He was so sad that he could not linger in that land. He stayed only long enough to buy the gifts which he had promised to bring the servants. Along with the other gifts, he carried a stone from the palace garden of his betrothed. When Clarina received her gift, she heard the story of the mysterious disappearance of the prince's bride. As soon as she held the stone in her hand, she knew that it had come from the wall of her own beloved garden. Joy shone in her beautiful eyes. For the first time, the prince noticed how very lovely Clarina was. He had always liked the little maid, even when her face was sad. But now that she was happy, he saw that she was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. "What does that pretty little maid intend to do with that stone?" he asked the queen. "I cannot guess," replied the queen. "She seems happy enough to receive it. I never saw her look happy before. Trouble seems to follow her wherever she undertakes. I was at the point of discharging her. She's caused me nothing but endless annoyance. I hired her only to please you." The prince followed Clarina and listened at her door. Inside her room she was talking to the stone. "Oh, stone from my garden wall," she was saying, "how are the flowers of my garden?" The prince could hardly believe his ears. Suddenly he guessed what the truth might be. He burst into the room. "Are you my betrothed who has disappeared from her own land?" he asked Clarina. She smiled into his eyes. "Trouble when one's young is hard enough to bear," she said when she had told all of her story. "I've had quite enough to last me all my life." "Your woes are ended now, and a happy life lies before you," said the prince. "Our wedding shall be celebrated at once." The end. Okay, and story number 2. The Little Maid Who Was Wise. The story of a robber who was outwitted. Long ago there lived a merchant who had 3 daughters. Every year at a certain day of a certain month he went away to a distant city to collect money on an account. His wife and daughters remained at home, and all went well until one sad day the wife died. That year the merchant looked forward to his journey with dread, for he would have to leave his daughters alone. "I cannot bear to go away," he said to them. "My heart is filled with fear, lest some evil may befall you during my absence." He worried about the matter night and day. The business was most important, and there was no one whom he could send to transact it for him. However, the question of leaving 3 such pretty girls unprotected was a thing not to be regarded lightly. "Do not be afraid to leave us, dear father," said his daughters. "Nothing will harm us while you are away." "How do you know?" asked their father. "I am older and wiser than you are, and I know that there are many evils in which might come to you. There are many bold thieves in the city, for instance, who would only be too ready to take advantage of my absence and rob my home of all I possess. We can lock ourselves securely in the house and not let anyone enter," said the 3 daughters. "Be sure that you admit no one," commanded the merchant. They gave him their promise, and he started on his journey. Nevertheless, he went with an anxious heart. Now outside the city there was a band of bold robbers. The captain of the band had watched the merchant's departure, and when he was safely away, the thief dressed himself up in the disguise of an old beggar. When it was evening, he led his band into a nearby street, and in his disguise he approached the merchant's house. He knocked at the door. "Have pity on a poor unfortunate one," he called out. "It is raining outside, and no one with mercy in his heart could turn away one who begs shelter from the storm. Let me enter, I pray to you, to pass the night under your roof." "It's surely a terrible storm outside," said the merchant's eldest daughter. as the wind rattled the tiles of the roof and rain began to beat in torrents against the doors and windows. "I think we ought to take pity on a poor beggar on a night like this." The second daughter peeped out of the window at the beggar. "He is old as well as poor," she said. "Our father has always taught us to show mercy and kindness to the aged." "Remember our promise to our father," cried the youngest one. "We gave him our word that we would admit no one. We can give this poor beggar some alms and send him away with a blessing." The oldest daughter frowned. "It is not for the youngest and most childish one of us to make the plans," she said. The second daughter added, "We too are older and wiser than you are. It is for us to determine what shall be done. If we decide to show mercy to this poor beggar, it is not for you to oppose it." "But we should not forget our promise to our father," cried the youngest daughter. However, in spite of all she could say, the eldest sisters opened the door and admitted the beggar. They led him to the kitchen to dry his clothes. Then they made ready a bed for him to sleep upon. They gave him his supper in the kitchen, and then they ate their own. "It is a fearful night to send away a beggar," said the eldest sister while they were eating. "I'm glad we have made him comfortable for the night," remarked the middle sister. "I'm thinking that our dear father would be anxious if he knew that we had broken our promise so easily," said the youngest sister. "For shame!" cried the eldest. "I do not think it was breaking our promise to show kindness to a poor old beggar," said the middle one. "A promise is a promise, nevertheless," said the youngest. While they were talking, the beggar had taken the apples which the girls were to eat for dessert, and had sprinkled a sleeping powder over them. The two eldest ate their apples, but the youngest could not eat that night. She threw the apple away. As soon as they had eaten, the girls went to their room, and the two eldest were overcome with sleep almost before they had time to get into bed. The youngest was so frightened that she could not sleep a single wink. Soon she heard footsteps. The beggar entered the room. The youngest one pretended that she too was asleep. The man went to the bed of the eldest sister and stuck a pin into her foot to see if she was completely unconscious. She did not stir, and he knew that the sleeping powder had thoroughly done its work. Then he went to the bed of the second sister and did the same. She was as completely unconscious as her sister. It hurt terribly when he stuck the pin into the foot of the youngest, but she did not stir. The robber thought that she was as completely overcome by the sleeping powder as the others. The youngest sister peeped through her long, heavy eyelashes and watched the beggar. She saw to her surprise that he had laid aside the heavy, ragged old coat which he had kept wrapped about him even while he ate. Underneath, he was dressed like a robber with a sword, pistols, and dagger. She was so terribly frightened that it was all she could do to keep her teeth from chattering. She heard the robber go about the house picking out the valuables which he wanted to steal. Then she heard him go down the stairway and unbolt the heavy doors which led into the store. She quietly got up and crept out of the room to hear him more distinctly. On a chair in the dining room, she saw the sword which he had taken off. He had evidently thought that, with all three girls so sound asleep, he did not need to use his weapons. Soon she heard the heavy outer doors of the store unbolted. The robber had gone outside to call the rest of his band. The little girl flew down the stairs and closed the doors of the store securely. They were big and heavy, but her great fear gave her strength. "He'll find it difficult to get into our house again," she said to herself as she waited to see if the robber returned. Soon she heard footsteps outside. She knew that the thief had brought back the others with him. There were frightful words said when they found that the door was shut. "It was the youngest one who deceived me," cried the robber chieftain. "I knew all the time that she did not want to let me in. I was suspicious of her from the first." "Perhaps you can outwit her yet," cried another. "She may not be so wise as she appears. You can never tell." The leader of the band of thieves went up close to the keyhole and whispered, "Kind lady of the house, have pity on me." The merchant's daughter at first did not answer, but as he kept on calling to her, she finally asked him what it was that he wanted. "I have left my charm behind," he cried. "Pray, let me enter to get it. I promise I will do you no harm." I do not trust your promises, replied the little maid. You shall not come into my father's house. Pass the charm out to me, then, said the robber. It's in the fire, replied the girl. Go throw vinegar on the fire and put it out, said the captain of the thieves. Then you can pull my charm out safely. Now it happened that there was a little hole in the door, just large enough for a man's hand to enter. It is the hole through which beggars often thrust outstretched hands, asking for alms. Put your hand through the hole in the door, replied the little maid. Then I'll give you your charm. She quickly ran upstairs and got the robber's sword, which he had left on a chair in the dining room. When she returned, his hand was sticking through the hole in the door. She struck it with all her might, with the great sword, and cut it off. The cries and curses of the robbers filled the air. They tried in vain to break down the great doors. The doors were strong and held securely. At last it was daylight, and the band of thieves had to flee. In the morning the effect of the sleeping powder wore off, and the two elder sisters awoke. When they heard their sister's story, they were filled with amazement. I don't believe a word of it, cried the oldest. You are making it up. You had a bad dream, said the second. I had such a nightmare myself that I have a headache this morning. It was not until their little sister had shown them the robber's hand and the great sword that they were convinced that she had told them the truth. Oh, why did we ever let that man into our house, cried the eldest. Why didn't we keep our promise to our father, cried the middle one. When at last the merchant returned from the distant city where he had been to collect his money, he was delighted to find his house and his 3 daughters safe. I see that no harm befell you in my absence, he said as he embraced them fondly. All my worries about you were foolish. The eldest daughter blushed and hung her head. Great danger threatened us while you were away, she said. Thanks to our youngest sister, we are safe. Our little sister was wiser than we were, said the middle daughter. When the merchant had heard the whole story, he said, After this we must all give ear to the wisdom of the little maid. She is wise beyond her years. The end. I think that first story is a piece of advice for young people, that a tough life is easier when you're young. Now that I'm not so young myself, I look forward to having some peace and quiet. And also, I noticed that the princess gets a name in that one, but the prince remains unnamed. A little bit of turnabout there. And the second story had a wild twist when she chops off old dude's hand. That was quite an escalation. Still, it is the youngest sibling that saves the day. And these stories give me lots of joy to read, and I look forward to reading more of them. But I am over halfway through with this book, so I plan on finishing it up sometime this year or maybe next year. And the podcast shoutout is to the Rewatch Recap. This is Dustin of Dustin Can Read and Watch, going back through classic TV shows episode by episode with a guest host. Currently, he's going through My So-Called Life and checking to see if it still holds up. And Dustin is a great guy, and it comes through on his show. And he has a pretty cool name. So, if you like his show as much as I do, go and give him a listen, a like, and a review. And the listener shout-out is to the city of Moroni on the island of Grand Comoros. It is the capital of this small nation of islands sandwiched between Madagascar and Mozambique. It was first settled by Austronesian or Malagasy people, who still make up the majority of the population of the neighboring Madagascar. Then it was settled by Swahili speakers, followed by Bantu, and finally Arabic speakers. It was also once a major city in the Sultanate of Bambao. It then went into being a protectorate of the French and now is the capital of the independent nation of the Comoros. So to my listeners in Moroni who speak Shikomori, aka the language of the islands, I say Marhaba and Masihu Memma. Thank you and good night.